The heavy manila envelope landed on my kitchen island with a dull, hollow thud. It arrived via certified mail, requiring my physical signature at the door, because my father always used the postal service when he wanted to make a devastating insult look like a standard legal obligation. The return address belonged to the polished downtown law offices of his personal attorney. The contents were supposed to be the final 10-year accounting of my late mother's estate. When my mother passed away a decade ago, she left behind a substantial 7-figure portfolio. The terms she set were simple and legally binding. The money was to be held in an irrevocable trust until my 35th birthday. Until that day, it was to be managed by my father, Richard Belmont, who was named as the sole fiduciary and trustee. For 10 years, my father played the role of the burdened financial steward perfectly. He lived in a gated community, drove a European sports car he claimed was a consulting perk, and took vacations to places that required a passport and a seaplane. At Thanksgiving dinners, while wearing custom Italian wool and checking his heavy gold watch, he would sigh and tell everyone how hard he was working to protect Maya's future from inflation. He always played the protector until today. Because today was the deadline for him to produce the final ledger for the probate court, allowing him to officially close the trust and walk away. I broke the seal on the envelope, pulled out the thick stack of stapled paper, and flipped directly past the legal jargon to the summary page at the back. I expected to see a transfer date, when I expected to see the banking instructions for my distribution. Instead, I saw a final balance, $412.16. I didn't gasp. I didn't drop the paper. I just stared at the black ink until the edges of my vision went sharp and cold. $400 left from a lifetime of my mother's work. Attached to the front of the summary was a letter from my father's attorney, filled with the kind of sterile, sanitized language designed to make complete devastation sound like a routine clerical update. Aggressive market corrections, unprecedented volatility in the tech sector, fiduciary exhaustion of principal due to unavoidable macroeconomic downturns. And clipped behind that formal letter was a personal note from my father, written in his jagged, arrogant handwriting. "The market crashed, Maya. I did everything I could to save your mother's legacy, but the algorithms wiped us out over the last few years. It's a tragedy, but we have to accept it. I've included a waiver of final accounting. Sign it and send it to my lawyer so the judge can discharge me and close the file next Thursday. Love, Dad. Accept it." That was his favorite phrase. In my family, accept it was the command my father used when he wanted you to stop asking questions and absorb his narrative as absolute fact. The old version of me would have cried. The old version of me would have felt guilty for making him feel bad about losing the money, assuming he had tried his best and failed. But I am not the old version of me. And I don't look at handwritten apologies. I look at metadata. When I set his note aside and flattened the actual transaction logs against the marble counter, my father had provided a heavily condensed, highly redacted version of the ledger. Hundreds of pages boiled down to quarterly summaries, assuming I wouldn't know how to read the columns. He assumed I would see red text, assume it meant a stock went down, and sign the waiver just to avoid the headache of looking at the math. But thieves who wear expensive suits always make the exact same mistake. They think spreadsheets are boring, so they assume you won't look at the raw data. I ran my finger down the column for the third quarter of 2021. It was a year the broader market had posted record highs, but my trust recorded a massive capital loss deduction of $180,000. My father had confidently labeled the line item Equities Depreciation/Portfolio Restructuring, but my eyes didn't stay on his label. They moved to the far right margin, to the tiny alphanumeric transaction code generated by the bank's clearinghouse. It didn't say TRD for trade. It didn't say M-FEE for management fee. It said EXT-WRE, external wire. You don't wire money to a stock market crash. You wire money to a bank account. My pulse didn't race. It slowed down, settling into a heavy, methodical rhythm. Because my father wasn't preparing for a discharge hearing. He was preparing for a getaway. I didn't call him. I didn't text him to demand answers so he could have time to practice his lies and hide his tracks. I picked up my phone, bypassed every probate lawyer in my contacts, and called a firm that doesn't argue about feelings or family dynamics. I called a forensic accountant. 2 hours later, I walked into the downtown office of Nolan Reed. The office didn't have mahogany bookshelves or leather couches. It had frosted glass walls, strict digital access controls, and the distinct quiet hum of heavy processing servers. Nolan Reed was a certified fraud examiner who specialized in unwinding high-net-worth embezzlement, and he looked at people the exact same way he looked at numbers, like he was waiting for them to balance. I sat across from him and slid the manila envelope across his bare desk. "My father is the trustee of my mother's estate," I said, my voice completely flat. "He filed this final accounting with the court this morning. He claims the stock market crashed and wiped out a 7-figure principal, and he wants me to sign a waiver before a hearing next Thursday." Reed didn't offer a polite smile. He just opened the envelope. "And you disagree," Reed said, his eyes already scanning the summary page. "I don't disagree," I replied. "I dispute the transaction codes." Reed stopped at the 2021 page. His index finger hovered exactly where mine had hovered in my kitchen. He saw the EXT-WRE tag immediately. "He categorized this as a depreciation loss," Reed said quietly. "Yes," I said. "But it's a wire routing tag," Reed murmured, pulling the page closer to his desk lamp. "And he didn't redact the clearinghouse routing suffix on the destination string." "Can you trace it?" I asked. Reed didn't answer right away. He turned to his primary monitor, opened a secure financial database terminal, and typed the 12-digit destination string from the paper directly into the search field. The keyboard clacked in the quiet room, sounding like a lock clicking into place. "A market loss stays inside the brokerage ecosystem," Reed said. His eyes locked on the screen as the database queried the global registry. "A wire transfer leaves the building. If he sent this to a legitimate equity fund, the routing suffix will trace back to a registered institutional broker." The screen flashed green, the search completed. Reed stopped typing. He stared at the monitor for a long, heavy second, and then he leaned back in his chair. He didn't look shocked. He looked like a man who had just caught a thief, with his hand perfectly illuminated by a spotlight. "Ms. Belmont," Reed said, his voice dropping an octave. "Your father didn't lose $180,000 to an algorithm." I kept my hands perfectly still in my lap. "Where did he send it?" Reed turned the monitor slightly so I could see the registration data attached to the routing number. It wasn't Wall Street. It wasn't an investment bank. "He sent it to a private maritime escrow account in the Cayman Islands," Reed said, tapping the screen once. "And the beneficiary entity registered to that account is a luxury yacht dealership." Nolan's office was silent except for the low hum of his processor. "A yacht," I repeated. The word tasted like copper in my mouth. He categorized a luxury watercraft as a portfolio restructuring. "Embezzlers usually start small," Nolan said, not taking his eyes off the screen. "A dinner here, a golf membership there. But when 10 years go by and no one asks for a receipt, they get arrogant." He tapped a key, and the Cayman Islands registration expanded. "The beneficiary entity is registered as Blue Horizon Holdings, LLC," Nolan read. "And if I run a cross-reference on that entity—" More typing. The database churned. "The sole managing member is Richard Belmont." I looked at the thick stack of papers I had brought in. Hundreds of pages of lies. "Run the rest of it," I said. Nolan didn't hesitate. He took the entire heavy packet, sliced the binding off with a sharp letter opener, and fed the pages into a high-speed commercial scanner sitting on the edge of his desk. "The PDF your father sent is a flattened summary," Nolan explained over the whir of the machine. "But accounting software leaves digital watermarks. I'm running optical character recognition to strip away his custom labels and pull the raw clearinghouse transaction codes. We sat in silence while the machine digested 10 years of my mother's legacy. When it finished, Nolan ran a proprietary extraction script. Columns of data flooded his second monitor. It didn't look like a financial summary anymore. It looked like an autopsy. Nolan highlighted a block of transactions from 2022. He claimed a $40,000 loss here under market volatility, Nolan said. The raw code is a direct ACH transfer to an exclusive country club in Florida. Initiation fee. He scrolled down. Here is $12,000 a month for advisory fees, he continued, routed directly to a domestic shell company called Belmont Consulting, which I guarantee has no employees and no clients. I watched my mother's life's work evaporate into golf swings and fake invoices. My hands didn't shake. My throat didn't close. I felt a profound, dangerous stillness settle over my chest because my father had sat at my dining room table 6 months ago, looking me in the eye, and told me he was losing sleep over the global markets. My phone buzzed against the glass surface of Nolan's conference table. The caller ID lit up. Dad. Nolan stopped scrolling and looked at the phone, then at me. I didn't decline the call. I didn't silence it. I swiped to answer and put it on speaker, resting my hands in my lap. Hi, Dad, I said. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any edge or accusation. Maya, sweetheart. His deep, confident voice filled the sterile office. I saw the delivery confirmation. I know you received the packet. I did, I said. He let out a heavy, theatrical sigh, the kind of sigh a martyr makes. I know it's a shock, he said gently. Believe me, it breaks my heart to hand you that ledger. I spent years trying to hedge against the tech bubble, but the market is just ruthless. It spared no one. It's a lot of money to lose, I replied calmly. It is, he agreed quickly, sensing my compliance. But we have to be realistic, Maya. The trust is drained. The only thing left to do is close the account so we don't incur more administrative fees. Did you see the waiver I attached? I saw it. Good, he said, his tone brightening with relief. I need you to sign it and email it to my lawyer by tomorrow morning. The judge has us on the docket for Thursday, and if we present the signed waiver, he discharges me as trustee. The court closes the file, and we can finally put this painful chapter behind us. Put it behind us. He meant bury it. He meant legal immunity. Once a probate judge signs a discharge order with a beneficiary's waiver, the trustee is released from all liability. The theft becomes legally permanent. I looked at Nolan's monitor where a $40,000 country club membership was currently highlighted in bright yellow. I understand the timeline, Dad, I said. I knew you would, he said warmly. You've always been so mature about these things. Send me a text when you've emailed it to the lawyer. Love you, kiddo. Goodbye, I said. I ended the call. Nolan looked at me, his expression perfectly neutral, but his eyes were sharp with professional respect. You didn't challenge him, Nolan noted. If I challenge him now, he drains the shell companies and moves the physical assets before Thursday, I said. I want him to walk into that courtroom believing he won. Nolan nodded once, then turned back to his keyboard. If we're going to blindside him in court, Nolan said, we need more than just mismatched transaction codes. We need the physical paper trail of where the money currently sits. Judges don't freeze assets based on a spreadsheet anomaly. They freeze assets based on hard, incontrovertible banking evidence. Can you get it? I asked. I can trace the routing numbers, Nolan said. But to get the actual account statements from Blue Horizon Holdings and Belmont Consulting, we need a subpoena, and we don't have time to file for one before Thursday. He was right. Subpoenas take weeks. My father had timed the delivery of the final accounting perfectly to give me zero runway to fight back through standard discovery. But Nolan didn't look defeated. He looked engaged. He opened a new window on his terminal, a secure portal that looked different from the public databases. Fortunately, Nolan murmured, his fingers flying across the keys. "Your father made a critical, arrogant mistake." "What mistake?" "He used his personal attorney to draft the final accounting," Nolan said, pulling up the letterhead from the envelope I had brought. "The law firm of Vance and Sterling. They are a reputable firm. They don't knowingly submit fraudulent ledgers to a probate judge." "But they did submit it," I pointed out. "They submitted what your father gave them," Nolan corrected. "But law firms require their clients to sign an internal sworn declaration of accuracy before they file a final accounting with the court. It protects the firm from malpractice if the client is lying." Nolan hit enter, and a schematic of banking regulations populated his screen. "Your father didn't just lie to you," Nolan said, turning to face me. "He lied to his own legal counsel. And under state probate rules, a trustee's financial disclosures to their own attorney regarding trust assets are not protected by attorney-client privilege if those disclosures are made in the furtherance of a crime or fraud." I felt my pulse steady into a cold, hard line. "So, how do we get the proof?" I asked. Nolan reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a blank, heavy stock folder. "We don't subpoena the banks," Nolan said quietly. "When we subpoena the lawyer." He looked back at the screen and his jaw tightened slightly as a new piece of data loaded. "And we need to do it right now," Nolan added, his voice dropping. "Why right now?" I asked. Nolan pointed to a pending transaction code that had just appeared at the very bottom of the extracted raw data list. A transaction dated for next Friday, one day after the discharge hearing. Because my father wasn't just planning to walk away from the trust, he was planning to walk away from the country. Nolan tapped the pending transaction on his screen. "This is a scheduled outbound wire," he said. "The destination is a private depository in Cyprus, and the amount matches the exact current valuation of Blue Horizon Holdings and his domestic shell companies." "He's liquidating," I said. "He's disappearing," Nolan corrected. "Well, at the moment the judge signs that discharge order on Thursday, his fiduciary liability officially vanishes. It's a legal concept called res judicata. Once the probate court accepts his accounting and discharges him, you are permanently barred from suing him for breach of trust. He clicks send on Friday and the money leaves U.S. banking jurisdiction forever." I stared at the blinking cursor on the screen. "So we file an injunction today," I said. Nolan shook his head. "If you file an emergency injunction today, you tip him off. He pulls the hearing off the calendar, initiates the Cyprus wire immediately, and buries the shell company behind 3 layers of international privacy laws. You'd spend the next 10 years and $500,000 trying to pierce the corporate veil in a foreign court." "Then how do we stop the wire?" I asked. Now Nolan closed the secure terminal. He reached down to the floor and picked up his heavy leather briefcase, setting it on the glass table. "We don't stop the wire," Nolan said, his voice dropping into a register of pure, calculated absolute. "We freeze the entire domestic infrastructure that holds it." He tapped his fingers on the briefcase. "We let your father walk into that courtroom," Nolan continued. "We let him stand in front of a judge and enter his fabricated ledger into the official court record under penalty of perjury. We let his attorney vouch for it, and the exact second he does." Nolan let the heavy brass latch click shut. I opened my briefcase. 2 days later, the halls of the probate court smelled like polished wood and stale anxiety. I wore a tailored navy blazer and stood near the back of the corridor, my hands steady at my sides. At 9:15, the elevator doors parted, and my father stepped out. He didn't look like a man who had stolen his daughter's future. He looked exactly the way a thief looks when he thinks he's operating entirely within the rules he wrote. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, a subdued silk tie, and an expression of practiced, weary solemnity. Beside him walked his attorney, Gregory Lynn, a senior partner whose billable rate suggested he didn't deal with messy family disputes, only clean, efficient, sterilized legal maneuvers. Lynn held a pristine leather folder containing the final petition. My father spotted me standing near the courtroom doors, and his posture shifted perfectly into the role of the tragic, loving parent. He walked over, his face softening with manufactured sympathy. "Maya," he said gently, but reaching out as if to touch my shoulder. I took one half-step back, not a flinch, just a boundary. His hand dropped, but his smile stayed glued in place, unbothered by my coldness. "I checked my email this morning," he said, keeping his voice low and soothing. "You didn't send the waiver to Gregory." "No," I said. "I didn't." My father sighed, a heavy, patient sound designed to make me feel like a difficult child who just couldn't grasp reality. "Maya, please," he said. "I know it's painful to face the numbers, but prolonging this doesn't bring the money back. The market took it. Making a scene today only wastes the court's time and eats up what little cash I have left to pay Gregory." I looked at his wrist. The watch he was wearing was a Patek Philippe. It retailed for roughly $60,000. I didn't point it out. I didn't scream that he was wearing my mother's legacy on his arm, because screaming is what victims do, and I was just here to document. "I'm not going to make a scene, Dad," I said quietly. "I just want everything on the official record." My father's eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second, scanning my face for weakness. Finding only a flat, calm compliance, he nodded. "Fine," he murmured. "If you need to hear the judge say it to get closure, then let's get it over with." He turned and walked through the double doors of Department 6. He didn't notice the man in the gray suit who had been standing quietly by the water fountain. Nolan Reed fell into step beside me, his heavy leather briefcase gripped firmly in his right hand. "Showtime," Nolan said quietly. Inside the courtroom, Judge Harrison sat at the bench, or reviewing a stack of morning files. She was a sharp, no-nonsense magistrate who did not tolerate emotional outbursts or wasted docket time. "Estate of Eleanor Belmont," the bailiff called out. My father and Gregory Lynn stepped confidently to the petitioner's table. I walked to the respondent's table. Nolan sat in the first row of the gallery directly behind the wooden partition, placing his briefcase on his lap. Judge Harrison adjusted her glasses and opened the thick file my father had submitted. "Mr. Lynn," Judge Harrison said, "I have a petition for the final accounting and discharge of the trustee, Richard Belmont. I note there is no beneficiary waiver of accounting attached to this filing." "That is correct, Your Honor," Lynn said smoothly, his voice echoing with professional ease. "The beneficiary is present today. Unfortunately, the trust suffered catastrophic losses due to the unprecedented market downturns in the tech sector over the last decade. The principal is functionally exhausted. Mr. Belmont is seeking formal court discharge to close the administration." The judge flipped to the summary page, the same page that showed $412. She looked at my father. He bowed his head slightly, looking down at his hands, performing the role of the devastated steward flawlessly. That's when Judge Harrison looked at me. "Ms. Belmont," she said, her voice softening just a fraction, projecting the usual sympathy reserved for beneficiaries who didn't understand finance. "I understand this is a difficult outcome. Have you reviewed the final accounting provided by the trustee?" "I have, Your Honor," I said. "And do you have any objections to the court entering this ledger into the record and granting the trustee's discharge?" she asked. My father turned his head slightly, giving me a soft, encouraging nod. "Accept it," his eyes said. "It's over." I placed my hands flat on the defense table. "I do object, Your Honor," I said, my voice ringing clear, cold, and entirely devoid of grief. Gregory Lynn sighed audibly, stepping closer to the microphone like a teacher correcting a stubborn student. "Your Honor, it is extremely common for beneficiaries to struggle with the harsh reality of market volatility," Lynn said softly. "But my client has provided a certified 10-year ledger prepared under strict fiduciary standards. The numbers, however unfortunate, are absolute." "The numbers are absolute," I agreed, not looking at Lynn, but keeping my eyes locked on the judge. But the labels are a lie. The courtroom went dead quiet. Judge Harrison's eyebrows raised. "Excuse me?" "My father didn't lose my mother's trust to market volatility," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "He lost it to luxury yachts, private country clubs, and domestic shell companies, and I brought the raw clearinghouse transaction data to prove it." My father let out a short, patronizing laugh, shaking his head. "Your Honor, my daughter is grieving," my father said, stepping forward, using his deep, authoritative tone to try and smother my claim. "She doesn't understand institutional financial documents. She sees red ink, she sees capital depreciation, and she assumes malice." I assure the court, "This ledger was prepared by licensed professionals." "That's exactly the problem," I said. I turned slightly and nodded to the gallery. Nolan Reed stood up, unlatched the heavy brass locks on his briefcase, and the loud click-clack echoed through the room like a hammer hitting an anvil. Because when a certified fraud examiner unzips his briefcase in a probate court, the air leaves the room. Nolan Reed didn't swagger. He walked through the wooden partition gate with the measured, quiet pace of an auditor who had ruined 100 wealthy men before breakfast. He didn't look at my father. He didn't look at Gregory Lynn. He looked straight at the clerk and handed over 3 identical, heavily bound volumes. One for the judge, one for opposing counsel, and one for the official record. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady and completely flat. "This is Nolan Reed. He is a certified fraud examiner, and he has the raw data that my father stripped out of the ledger he just asked you to sign." Gregory Lynn's head snapped toward me and then toward Nolan. The polished, sterilized confidence he had carried into the room evaporated in an instant. "Objection," Lynn said loudly, his voice suddenly sharp, trying to build a procedural wall to hide behind. "Your Honor, this is an ambush. This expert was not disclosed, and these documents have not been produced in discovery. We have a right to review—" "Counsel," Judge Harrison interrupted, her voice dropping into a register of cold stone. "Your client is asking this court to permanently discharge his fiduciary duty and approve the catastrophic loss of a 7-figure trust. If there is an allegation of active fraud regarding the very document you just handed me, I am going to look at it." The clerk passed the heavy binder up to the bench. It didn't hit the wood with a soft tap. It hit the wood with a loud, heavy thud. And that was the exact moment my father realized his European suits and his deep, authoritative voice meant absolutely nothing in this room. Judge Harrison opened the binder. "Mr. Reed," she said, reading his credentials off the cover page. "What exactly am I looking at?" Nolan stood beside my table, his hands loosely clasped in front of him. He spoke in a tone so devoid of emotion it felt clinical. "Turn to tab 3, Your Honor," Nolan said. "You will see the petitioner's submitted ledger on the left. No claiming a $180,000 equity depreciation loss in the third quarter of 2021, a loss he blamed on market volatility." The judge looked at the page. "I see it." "On the right," Nolan continued, "is the raw, unredacted clearinghouse data, which I extracted via optical character recognition from the digital watermarks left on his own PDF submission. The transaction code is not an equity trade, Your Honor. It is an external wire." My father's face went the color of wet ash. "And the destination of this wire?" Judge Harrison asked, her eyes narrowing at the page. "A private offshore escrow account in the Cayman Islands," Nolan stated cleanly. "The registered beneficiary is Blue Horizon Holdings, LLC, which cross-references to a luxury maritime dealership. The managing member of that LLC is your trustee, Richard Belmont." My father's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at Gregory Lynn, expecting his expensive attorney to jump in, to object, to use some brilliant legal maneuver to shut this down. But Gregory Lynn wasn't looking at the judge. He was frantically flipping through his own copy of the binder, his eyes scanning the extracted transaction codes. And that's when Gregory Lynn stopped defending his client and started defending his law license. "Your Honor," Lynn said, his voice tight and completely devoid of advocacy, "I must state for the record that my firm prepared the final accounting based strictly on the sworn representations and flattened files provided directly by Mr. Belmont. We had no knowledge of offshore wire transfers." Lynn literally took a physical step sideways, distancing himself from my father, because lawyers will fight for you when you are sued, but they will throw you to the wolves the absolute second you trick them into submitting perjury to a federal or state judge. My father was completely alone. He tried to rely on the only tactic he had left, his ability to gaslight. "This is a misunderstanding," my father said, his voice trembling slightly, the deep resonance completely gone. "Your Honor, I can explain. Those were alternative asset investments. The tech market was failing, so I diversified the portfolio into tangible assets to hedge against inflation. A boat holds value. It was a strategy." I didn't roll my eyes. I didn't yell at him for calling a yacht an investment strategy. I just watched the judge. Judge Harrison looked at my father as if he were a stain on her courtroom floor. "A strategy," Judge Harrison repeated, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Mr. Belmont, you transferred trust funds to a shell company in your own name to purchase a luxury watercraft, and then you labeled the transaction depreciation on a sworn court document." "I was going to pay it back," my father blurted out. It was the dumbest thing he could have possibly said. In a fraud hearing, saying you were going to pay it back isn't a defense. It is a full recorded confession of embezzlement. The court reporter's fingers flew across the stenograph machine, permanently cementing his words into the official transcript. Judge Harrison turned the page to tab 4. "And what is this, Mr. Reed?" the judge asked, pointing to a line item from 2 years ago. $40,000 labeled as a portfolio restructuring fee. "That is a direct ACH transfer to the Cypress Point Country Club in Florida," Nolan answered smoothly. "An initiation fee for a personal golf membership. Tab 5 shows recurring monthly transfers of $12,000 labeled as advisory fees, routed to a domestic entity called Belmont Consulting, which has no employees, no business license, and is wholly owned by the trustee." My father gripped the edge of the petitioner's table, so hard his knuckles turned white. He was breathing in shallow, erratic gasps. He turned to me, his eyes wide and frantic. "Maya, please," he whispered across the aisle. "I'm your father. Don't do this." I looked right back at him, my posture perfectly straight, my hands folded on the table. "How you didn't act like my father when you drained my mother's accounts," I said quietly. "You acted like a thief, and thieves don't get waivers." Judge Harrison closed the heavy binder. The sound echoed like a vault locking. "Mr. Belmont," the judge said, her tone signaling that the procedural portion of the morning was officially over and the punitive portion had begun. "You have fundamentally breached your fiduciary duty. You have committed civil fraud, you have committed perjury in my courtroom, and you have stolen from your own daughter." My father shook his head rapidly. "I didn't take all of it. There is still equity in the properties. If you just give me time to liquidate—" "You don't need time to liquidate," Nolan interrupted, his voice cutting through the panic. Nolan looked directly at the judge. "Turn to the final tab." "Your Honor," Nolan said. Judge Harrison opened the binder one last time. "Yesterday afternoon, I audited the active routing queue for the trust's primary holding account," Nolan explained, pointing to a single printed screenshot. "The trustee initiated a complete liquidation of his domestic shell companies and the remaining trust liquidity. The funds are currently sitting in a holding pattern." My father's face went perfectly slack. He stopped breathing. "And where are the funds scheduled to go?" the judge asked, her eyes tracing the alphanumeric string on the page. "Tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., Nolan said, dealing the final fatal blow. An outbound wire is scheduled to sweep the entire balance to a private depository in Cyprus, a non-extradition jurisdiction, because a father who makes a bad investment stays to apologize. But a father who schedules an international wire transfer the day after his discharge hearing is a flight risk." The judge looked up from the binder and her eyes locked onto my father with a cold, terrifying finality. The trap had successfully closed. The silence in Department 6 was so absolute, it felt like the air had been pulled out of the room. Judge Harrison didn't yell. Judges don't need volume when they have jurisdiction. She simply looked at my father, and the disgust in her eyes was cold, heavy, and completely professional. "Mr. Lynn," Judge Harrison said, her voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls, "did you have any knowledge that your client was scheduled to wire the totality of these disputed assets to a foreign depository tomorrow morning?" Gregory Lynn looked physically ill. Then he gathered his papers with hands that were visibly shaking. "Absolutely not, Your Honor," Lynn said, his voice clipped and desperate. "My firm was retained solely to file the final accounting based on domestic ledgers provided by the trustee. We do not facilitate, nor do we advise on, international transfers of contested assets." Lynn didn't stop there. He looked up at the bench and delivered the final fatal blow to my father's legal defense. "In light of the evidence presented today and the clear conflict of interest regarding the veracity of the filings," Lynn said, "I am making an oral motion to immediately withdraw as counsel of record for Mr. Belmont." My father snapped his head toward his lawyer. "Gregory, you can't do that!" "I just did, Richard," Lynn hissed, not bothering to lower his voice. "You lied to me. And you used my firm to submit perjury." Judge Harrison didn't hesitate. "Motion to withdraw is granted," she said. She picked up her pen. "Mr. Belmont," the judge said, the scratching of her pen amplifying the silence in the room, "you are hereby removed as trustee of the Eleanor Belmont Trust, effective immediately, for gross breach of fiduciary duty and active fraud." My father gripped the edge of the table. He was panting slightly, the bespoke charcoal suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big for him. "Your Honor, please," he begged, the authoritative boardroom executive completely gone, replaced by a man who had just realized the exits were locked. "If you just let me access the accounts, I can reverse the transfers. I can make her whole. Just give me 48 hours. I didn't blink. I didn't smile. And I just watched him drown in the exact same system he thought he had mastered. "You don't have 48 hours, Judge Harrison said flatly. She looked at Nolan Reed, who was still standing quietly in the gallery. "Mr. Reed," she said, "does your firm have the exact routing numbers and institution details for the domestic accounts currently holding the liquidated funds?" "We do, Your Honor," Nolan said, tapping the heavy binder. "Tab 6 contains the full institutional routing data for Blue Horizon Holdings and Belmont Consulting, as well as his personal operating accounts." "Excellent," the judge said. She turned her attention back to the clerk. "I am issuing an immediate ex parte emergency freeze on all assets, accounts, and safety deposit boxes associated with Richard Belmont, Blue Horizon Holdings, LLC, and Belmont Consulting," she dictated cleanly. "I am drafting an emergency injunction directing the holding banks to halt any and all outbound wire transfers, specifically the transfer scheduled for Cyprus tomorrow at 8 a.m. No funds are to move without a direct order from this court." My father let out a sound that wasn't a word, just a hollow, panicked exhale. The money was frozen. The escape hatch was welded shut. "Furthermore," Judge Harrison continued, her eyes locking onto my father, I am appointing Ms. Belmont as the successor trustee to oversee the recovery of the estate, and I am referring this entire file, along with the transcript of today's hearing and Mr. Reed's forensic audit, to the District Attorney's Financial Crimes Unit and to the FBI, and given the attempted international wire fraud. My father stumbled back a half step, hitting the wooden chair behind him. "Maya," he said, turning to me, his voice cracking. Tears were actually pooling in his eyes now. "Maya, I'm your dad. I raised you. You can't let them send me to prison over a mistake." I looked at him. I didn't feel anger. I just felt the cold, clean weight of reality. "You didn't make a mistake, Dad," I said quietly. "You made a schedule, and I just canceled your flight." Judge Harrison struck the gavel. "The petition for discharge is denied with prejudice," she announced. "The asset freeze is active immediately. Court is adjourned." The bailiff moved swiftly, stepping between my father and the aisle, ensuring he didn't try to approach me. Nolan Reed quietly closed his briefcase, or the brass latches clicking shut with a final satisfying snap. I didn't wait for my father to say anything else. I didn't need an apology, and I didn't need to hear him lie again. I turned and walked through the heavy wooden doors, leaving him standing alone at the petitioner's table, effectively bankrupt and waiting for the federal government to knock on his door. When we stepped out into the bright sunlight of the courthouse steps, Nolan stopped and looked at me. "The injunction has already been electronically transmitted to the clearinghouses," Nolan said, checking a secure alert on his phone. "The Cypress wire was killed in the queue. The money isn't going anywhere." I took a deep breath of the crisp morning air. "Thank you, Nolan," I said. "Don't thank me," Nolan replied, his voice completely level. "Thank the metadata, so it never lies." 3 months later, the forensic audit was completed. The court authorized the seizure and liquidation of the luxury yacht held under my father's shell company, which had been sitting in a marina in Fort Lauderdale waiting for him. The country club membership was revoked, and the initiation fee was clawed back through a civil judgment. Between the frozen domestic accounts and the liquidated assets, we recovered 94% of my mother's original trust principal. My father never made it to Cyprus. He was indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and perjury, and is currently awaiting federal trial. If you found out your own parent drained your inheritance and blamed the economy, would you have confronted them at the dinner table? Or would you have stayed quiet and brought a forensic accountant to court like I did? Tell me what you would do in the comments below. If you love this story of cold, hard justice, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.